521, the Senator from the Cape and the Islands, Mr. Cyr, has filed an amendment, the title of which the clerk will read.
Number 521 by Mr. Cyr, childhood lead poisoning.
Thank you, Mr. President, and through you to the members. I think it's no secret for many members of this body that before joining you, I spent 6 years working at the Department of Public Health with some pretty remarkable public servants. And one of the biggest issues that we were looking at for years has been the impact of lead exposure on children in the Commonwealth and nationally. Massachusetts, a generation ago, was a leader on this issue. We were one of the first states to issue some of the most strict penalties, fines, building a robust system to intervene for young people who became lead poisoned. But that was in the 1980s and early 1990s. Actually, probably when I was one of those children being tested for blood lead levels under these requirements. And in the years since, Massachusetts has simply just not kept up. We have fallen behind CDC recommended guidelines on intervention for childhood lead poisoning. When we look at lead exposures for children, here in Massachusetts, the primary the primary exposure pathway is through leaded paint. We have over 80%. Lead paint existed in our paint until in the early 1980s. 80%, nearly 80% of our housing was built before that time. So most of the homes that our children, in fact, that we are living in, contain lead paint. The Department of Public Health and local health departments across the Commonwealth have been persistently chipping away at childhood lead exposure. But what we've learned as evidence emerges on lead exposure is that we used to think about if you had a certain level of exposure, that's really where we had the intervention. And the latest research and evidence over the last decade shows that basically any exposure to lead is very harmful. And so this is an amendment that would seek to both modernize, make tweaks to the statute. In full disclosure, this is something that I had sunk my teeth into in DPH and was unable to get done when I was there. But really, this would also bring Massachusetts into sort of the 21st century with childhood lead poisoning prevention. And it would also find resources for us to address this health inequity. Essentially, the childhood lead poisoning prevention is funded through a trust, through very minor assessments on certain professions. Those have not been raised since they were filed in 1994. I think that's when I was in first grade. So it's really time that we step up as a Commonwealth. I don't think we're prepared in this Senate budget to address this, but I really hope that we make meaningful strides on childhood lead poisoning prevention. I really worry that lead exposure is something that we care about when we see it in the news of Flint, Michigan, but something that we often forget, and I think we feel is a problem that we feel we've solved here, and it is not. So, Mr. President, I do ask unanimous consent for this amendment to be withdrawn.
Gentleman asks unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment. Is there an objection? Hearing no objections, the amendment is withdrawn. Senator Jalen, for what purpose does the gentle lady rise? The senator asks unanimous consent to make a brief statement. Are there any objections? Hearing none, Senator Jehlen.
I just wanted to rise in support of the senator's amendment, even though it's not going to be considered now. I want to say how important it is for us to begin again to pay attention to lead paint. I learned about lead paint when my children were among those who were involved in the first test of childhood lead levels. Dr. Needleman took their baby teeth and compared them with other children and found that the levels of lead affected children's behavior and children's achievement. Later on, one of my children had to be treated for lead poisoning, and I had several experiences.
Subdue your conversations in the chamber. Thank you, Senator. Senator Jalen.
I'm being inspired by the gentleman's previous remarks about his own life, and I'm telling you that I have lived in a neighborhood where all of the children were were exposed to lead not only from automobiles and paint, but from a smelter in our neighborhood. So all of the children were exposed to dangerous levels of lead. We've made a lot of progress, but I think that you still know that even in school, children are exposed to lead from the water. And there is still a predominance of lead paint removed in low-income communities. So I'm going to tie this to the achievement gap and say that if we want children to be raised healthy and to have the IQ and the achievement that we want them to have, we need to take lead paint, not lead, seriously. We need new resources. DPH in the last 17 years has been cut by almost 20% in real terms. They don't have the resources they need to identify children at risk, properties that are damaging to children, and to give the resources to help the children, help the property owners remediate and the children to recover. So, Mr. President, those new resources are identified in this amendment, which updates from 1993. How many years ago was that? Almost 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Updates the fees and fines from almost 25 years ago in a modest increase for violators and for people involved in transfer of real estate. Very, very modest. Something like $10 increase in a license. So, Mr. Chairman, I know that this is not going to be taken up today, but I want to put down a marker that we should take it up at the nearest possible opportunity. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose does the gentle lady rise? Senator Chang-Diaz asks unanimous consent to make a brief statement. Are there any objections? Hearing none, Senator Chang-Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and through you to the members. I also rise to speak on the same topic. I understand and the reasoning for withdrawing of the amendment by the gentleman from the Cape and the Islands, but wanted to throw my most strongly felt support behind the content of this amendment. The lack of urgency with which we are acting in Massachusetts on this issue is outrageous. It is a moral outrage. Just over a year ago, 2 years ago, Flint, Michigan was on everyone's minds, everyone's lips. It burst onto the world stage, and we watched in horror, and many months since then, watched in horror as bottled water had to be shipped into Flint for everything from bathing to drinking to doing the dishes. And we all wondered self-righteously, as the fingers were pointed this way and that in Michigan, why didn't they do anything to prevent that at the local level? Why didn't they do anything to prevent that at the state level? Where was the public sector to protect those children? We are doing the same thing here in Massachusetts. If you look, Reuters did a piece of investigative journalism a little over a year ago in which they looked at public health data across the country, and they found over 3,000 localities in which the blood, the lead levels in children's blood was double what it was in Flint, Michigan at the height of the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan. And I'm sorry to tell all my colleagues here that when you look at the map of Reuters findings, you'll see plenty of communities in Massachusetts in red on that map where our lead levels in our children are worse than double what they found in Flint, Michigan. What are we going to say when the news cameras are trained on us, or when our children look at us and say, what did you do to prevent this? Mr. President, if we have not acted on this issue before we take up the budget next year, I will be roll calling this amendment.
Mr. President?
Senator Lewis, for what purpose does the gentleman rise?
I, too, would like unanimous consent to make a brief statement, please. Thank you, Mr. President. I also feel that I need to chime in along with my colleagues on this issue. As the chair of the Public Health Committee, I'm well aware, and we all need to be well aware, as has been said so eloquently by the previous speakers, that the issue of lead poisoning and the harmful health impacts it can have on our children is not limited to Flint, Michigan, and other places outside of Massachusetts. It's very much a concern that we have here in the Commonwealth. In 2014, approximately 5,000 children in Massachusetts under the age of 4 years old had a blood lead level which is above the recommended maximum by the CDC. 5,000 children. And one of the problems that we have is not only are these assessments too low and have not been updated, as the Senator from the Cayman Islands rightly pointed out, since 1994, but we also have a blood lead level in Massachusetts which is, has also not been adjusted, and it's set at 25 micrograms per deciliter, whereas the CDC is at 5. And the current best research we have does demonstrate and suggest that we really need to update that. So this is a critical public health issue. It does demand more attention. I think it's a good thing that a number of us have made a point of speaking about it on the floor of the Senate today. I am disappointed that we unfortunately cannot take up this amendment in this current budget, but again, I would urge us to take this issue very seriously and look at a number of strategies to address the risk of lead poisoning, including increasing the fees that fund the DPH fund, as well as the level that we set as a safe maximum level, and also homeowner tax credits and other incentives for homeowners to do de-leading. So again, want to just raise the make sure we really do give this issue the serious attention that it deserves. Thank you, Mr. President.
For the edification of the members, amendment number 521 has been withdrawn, but I greatly appreciate the activism and the statements, and for what it's worth, this temporary chair, sitting here with the gavel currently, strongly